Welcome to another week of Fan View, the show where we talk about all things fan. We have two co-hosts tonight. So we have our usual host, Aaron, and we are joined by a very special guest, Dags. Dags, how are you?
The special guest, Dags. Yes, I'm very good. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks for having me on board. It's good to be a part of the show this evening. And before we get too far into it, I just wanted to point out to people that I'm still got the job of my button pushing. So even though I'm going to be looking over there most of the time at comments and all the rest of it, I'm not ignoring anybody. I've still got to do my job. So, yes, I just wanted to point that one out. But Sarah and Aaron, over to you guys.
Yes. Aaron, how are you this week?
Good. Been busy so far, and it's only Monday, so it's shaping up like a good week.
I hope that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Yes. No, so this week we are doing something a little bit different. We are discussing the rise of the Megacon. What is a Megacon, you might ask? A mega convention is a extra large convention, basically a convention on a global scale, and generally there's a huge amount of money behind them. So we're going to have a bit of a chat about the history of conventions and where everything has started, and then going on to what things are like now and what they might be like in the future. So moving right along, starting at the start, how did things begin in the world of conventions in Australia? Well, in the world, Aaron.
Well, it's interesting, and I guess to explain to everyone, while we've got a panel of three tonight, all three of us have been involved in conventions in different ways, and I think Dags has probably had the longest history with conventions in running and attending, and I've attended lots of them over the last 30 years in the dealer's room, and Sarah, you've been involved in fandom and cosplaying. So I guess when we look at our histories, we could probably pass it over to Dags to begin with as the history of how they started, and particularly in Australia, because you would have been around where there were no cons in Australia at all.
Oh, no, it wouldn't be that far. No, conventions in Australia have been around since the 1960s. So I'm not that old, dude. And Chris made a point that you two are apparently echoing. So we did a test before we went on air, and we were kind of thinking there may have been some echoing, but we're not sure how it is to fix it. That's bad English. I was in the convention scene, just getting back to that. For many decades, most conventions were based around literature, which is about books. And it wasn't until, in Australia at least, until the 80s where media conventions started to really make an appearance, which is all about movies and TV shows. So if you're saying about media cons, yeah, they effectively started with Star Trek, sort of in the late, I think it was in the late 1980 was the first one. But by the end of the 80s, they'd really taken off and become a really big occurrence. And while all this was going on, the literature conventions were still chugging away underneath. This is mainly Melbourne I'm referring to, not other cities. So I was there at their prime, and there's a long story regarding that. So, yeah.
So we're going back a little bit earlier than that when we're looking, I guess, at the real seeds of the mega conventions that we have today. And I guess there would probably be two that would stand out as the first two, what were laid the groundwork for sort of every media convention that's followed. And I guess the first one, and everyone's heard of this, is, of course, the San Diego Comic-Con.
One day I will get there. Do we want to bring up the slides?
Want a picture up? Yep. There we go.
So.
Sorry.
So the first San Diego Comic-Con, the first full convention was in 1970. They did have a mini con, which was a one-day con earlier to test how it would go and to raise some money. But then the first one was on August the 1st, and it had an amazing turnout of 300 people, which at the time was pretty huge, but now is kind of just a drop in the ocean to some of the huge conventions that we have that go on all over the world today. And that con was primarily for comic book collectors. It was put together by comic book dealers and Forrest Ackman, who I think some people would know as a big fan of the media and horror and run different magazines before the convention started. And it was so successful, it started in a hotel reception room where most smaller conventions start out, and it's grown to now it's spread over about 10 different buildings all over San Diego. Do you remember the first time you heard of Comic Con?
Who are you asking?
Either, I guess.
Sarah, you can go first.
I would have heard of it probably from The Simpsons, I'm sure, or somewhere like that. It would be something that I picked up as a child. I grew up in the country.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I've, in preparing for this week's episode, one of the things that really struck me is how the conventions we have today, in many ways, are the direct predecessor of things like the World's Fair and world conventions and world expos, whatever you want to call them. But yeah, those early, really early World's Fairs and the way that they used to, you know, everyone would get together to celebrate a culture and to show off all the technology of the time and the world of the future and things like that. And that really is, it's sort of, in a little bit of a way, I think that is what the modern con is directly a descendant of. Whether or not it's intentional or not, I feel like sometimes it's more linked to that than it is those early comic book conventions, because as we saw, 300 people as opposed to something like a World's Fair, which would have, you know, thousands.
Yeah. And the other thing is, when I was doing the research on this as well, it really did remind me of, Tony Stark and the fairs he was running early in the Iron Man series and things like that. I almost thought they were sort of echoing what happens at Comic Con now with the way that those things were running. Now, Comic Con was mainly for comics. Now you don't really get a comic dealer going because media has pushed it out. But there was a media fair based on a popular franchise, and I don't think anyone will be surprised what the first actual franchised convention was. And it was Star Trek Lives, a Star Trek convention. And I guess it's one of those things that I did not realize how big, I mean, I knew Star Trek was popular, but I did not realize how big a following it had at this time, where we've just seen San Diego Comic Con, which has gone on to be probably the biggest convention worldwide and the most renowned one, had 300 people turn up. Star Trek, the first convention, got 1,500 people turn up. And the other thing that I was incredibly surprised about, it was a convention, it was a multimedia convention. So although it had Star Trek, it had space scientists and NASA and live information on the Viking Mars probes going on at the time. And it is a real weird mix today, because I think if you had a convention today and you said, it's got Star Trek, it's got Star Wars, and we've got some people, some boffins from NASA that are going to like switch over to some live stuff on the lunar surface, it really seems like a totally different audience. So I think society has changed. And what you brought up, Sarah, I think is totally true, where a lot of people's perceptions of conventions comes through popular culture. So you've got your Big Bangs and your Star Trek, Simpsons, as you were saying, that kind of have introduced it more into the mainstream, whereas back in the early days, it was a section of society that, again, was maybe the library club and would look at the NASA stuff, where now it's more of a happening and more acceptable thing. And that's something I've definitely seen change over the decades.
Yeah, I just want to put out there that I was head of my high school's library committee. So definitely I understand it follows through. What were you going to say there, Dax?
It's quite common it was actually quite common for Star Trek conventions to have actual scientists appear, because Star Trek is a very science-orientated show. And of course, it helped boost the numbers of guests, because NASA people, regardless of who they work, what they do within NASA, are considered cool people. It's like you're the real deal, right? Even if you're the dude who just empties the rubbish bins out of the control room every second day. But it sort of adds a lot more credence to the lineup of people saying, well, if the TV show people aren't the go, then these real people will be the next thing in line. And even with Galactic Tours in 1986 in Australia here, they even had a person who was a space, like something to do with space in Australia and all this sort of thing. So even up until then, in the mid-'80s, it was still considered groovy to have scientists appear at a convention. And in ZenCon 2 in 88, they also did a similar thing. It was considered normal until, I guess, once people had the opportunity to bring in celebrities and actors from overseas, the scientists and that all kind of got shoved aside. So, but for a while, it was quite standard. So, yeah.
It's interesting you point that out. I was actually looking at the guest list for Dragon Con, which is happening in a couple of weeks in Anaheim. And it still has lots of scientists and astronauts and doctors and all these different people on the panel that, you know, the type of people we never would get really at a standard Australian pop culture expo. So it's a really interesting thing that they do still occasionally happen, but maybe it's something that just fell by the wayside in Australia. Maybe they weren't able to. I know we do have we had Dr. Carl at the last Supernova in Melbourne. So I guess that would be the closest we get now, but he was promoting his book. So I don't know.
I guess it probably pushes away from the pop culture side, which has become more dominant in the past couple of decades. And as opposed to when people really wanted to be educated about fiction and fact at the same time. So, yeah.
I've been corrected by Sully. I said Dragon Con is in Atlanta. I'm not meaning Dragon Con. I've forgotten what I'm meaning. I'm meaning the one that's in Anaheim in a couple of weeks. So whichever that one is, that's what I mean.
I remember going to one convention in Melbourne that did have an astronaut from NASA who gave a talk. And it was interesting. Not only did he do the convention, but he had a list of tour dates at different libraries and convention centres as well. So he was tapped onto the convention as part of the NASA tour, which is what Dags goes back to saying, it kind of brings an extra level of people who come to the convention as guests who might not go to a pop culture convention normally.
Good point in from Ange. It's about the draw card and what will make money. And dare I say, I guess a lot of scientists, unless you get somebody who's really high up the NASA food chain, but it's got to be the right event for it too. You can't just plonk them in anywhere. Yeah, with Star Trek, as we said earlier, it kind of worked with them because it was a science-based show effectively. So yeah.
I think it's probably also the return on investment. Well, if you've got someone in America, it's not super expensive to have someone fly partway across the country and put them up, and you know that they might be doing other things. Whereas bringing someone to Australia is always a big ask. So they probably wouldn't be able to offer a huge amount of money for a scientist or an astronaut unless they knew they were going to get return on it. So it would really need to be a celebrity astronaut, and I don't know how many celebrity astronauts they are. They tend to be quite humble people.
Well, William Shatner is now officially an astronaut, so there you
go. Very true. It's
very funny. Speak for the scientist community. What you were saying about bringing someone from overseas, this is the difference between the older style conventions and the new ones, where a lot of older style conventions, they might get one guest who might have appeared on a show and the rest might be behind the scenes. And if that guest fell through, it would ruin the convention. Now, with the modern conventions, you have a lineup of guests, and they usually say, well, if this guest pulls out, we can pull another one out of the hat somehow and make up for it. And I remember one particular convention here, they were meant to get Sophie Aldred, who was Ace from Doctor Who, and a couple of other guests, and none of them turned up. So there was a convention in Melbourne with 0 guests, and it was still fun because everyone got together and had a bit of a chat. But people who had come interstate for it, and a couple of people from New Zealand, were pretty cheesed off.
I feel sorry for the organisers of that event, because I'm sure they didn't quite get the return on their investment they were hoping for. Because unfortunately, I know that from the business side of things, a lot of conventions these days, one of the reasons they do rely so heavily on guests is that is where the money is for them. So we've got a little bit more on that Trek convention. We've got another slide, which has that. Ooh, here we go. Everybody welcome. I would love to know the demographic of that original Star Trek convention. I'd love to know, because I know early on, a lot of Star Trek fans were women, and a lot of just because it was a daytime show, and you know, it was sort of a housewife type show, and then slowly it became more and more the guys got into it, and it got nerdier, and the conventions became the more typical male-dominated spaces.
Well, it's interesting. Sorry, hang on, going to cut you off. No, I don't agree with that, Sarah, because
you disagree with
Star Trek, as a part of a person who's been involved with Star Trek fandom for almost 40 years, Star Trek at least is a franchise that has always appealed to both male and female equally. So this convention would have had a split between the male and female demographic, and would have remained that way up until even like now. So Austrek, who's the Star Trek fan club here, up until recently was run by a female for like years, and even in the 80s it was all run by women. So there are some fandoms that do, I agree, are very male dominated, but Star Trek is one because the show itself appeals to both males and females. the actual fandom for Star Trek has always been equally balanced, which is really good.
No,
That's actually
I
makes
stand
it
corrected.
really appealing. So,
No,
I needed to clarify that. So I needed to
No, that's
clarify.
okay.
So yeah, that convention, everybody welcome. I don't know what they're trying to say about that, but I think they would have been saying, even if you didn't watch Star Trek or didn't have an interest in it, you're welcome, rather than saying you must be a fan. That's possibly.
It's actually, knowing the history of that, it's probably more likely all races welcome because of the history of America, unfortunately.
So even Christie's saying it splits between male and female, and that's one of the good things about Star Trek fandom. So, sorry, there's the picture. Yeah.
Well, the other thing I did put a couple of pics up that were interesting because that convention was organized and run by a female. And in the previous slide, you saw her pictured with Kirk and Spock and the other cast members. So it is one of those fandoms that was really well diverse in genders right from the very beginning, as Dags was saying. And it is one of the conventions and one of the clubs, which I have to say has always been like that, where you can go to a Star Trek meeting and it's really well mixed, where some of the other clubs, I know I went for Doctor Who clubs for years and years, and you wouldn't see a girl in there from one Christmas meeting to the next Christmas meeting kind of thing.
There's a question here from Rod. He's asking about the Star Wars Boy Club in early years and stuff. No, that also had a very split mix as well, which was kind of good. It was more 60-40 if you wanted to. It depended on the focus of whatever it is you were doing. So I think maybe in later years it sort of shifted a bit more 70-30, but for a long period of time it was also equally balanced. Christy, who's watching the show now, joined Skyforce in the middle of the 90s, which was the Star Walking Social Club. And if she wants to answer this, she can answer that question as well. Yeah. When she attended Skyforce meetings, was it a good split between male and female? And I think you'll find the answer is yes.
Well, that's a good thing. Rod has said females, curses in Ferengi. Every time I agree with that. Every time I hear people refer to women specifically as females, I can't help but hear a Ferengi saying it. All right. So Christy said, I know the boys would only let me play Star Wars if I played a helpless Leia. That's what Christy has said. Yeah, no, that's I think that is quite a common experience. That it's one of those things where it's not necessarily women are not interested in the spaces. It's whether or not they feel comfortable staying in the spaces, and that's the real test of a group, and how it is able to keep things welcoming. All right, so we're moving on. I think we've got the first Oz convention here. So we've got OzCon 92, we've got OzCon 2. Aaron, tell us a bit about this.
So this is one of those, we get Oz Comic Con, but this is one of those mostly forgotten ones. Now, I attended a couple of these up in Sydney, and it was one of the first big multimedia conventions up in the Sydney Convention Centre on Sydney Harbour, which I think is gone now. I don't know if you got up to any of these ones, Dags?
Yeah, I went to one, but I think it was in the mid-90s. We had a booth and we were promoting Star Walking up there, but I can't remember which one it was exactly.
Yeah, so this would be the first experience I can remember where there was a lot of cosplayers. There was that general, more Comic-Con thing where it wasn't all based on one franchise. It was a more lots of different dealers, lots of retailers, guests from different shows and things like that. It was a really early one, but I do remember being totally blown away that something like this could be happening in Australia, because up until that point it was mainly fan-made ones, and we've kind of skipped over that a bit because that's probably a show on its own, because we're looking how the conventions have become the megacons we've got today. But this is sort of the stepping stones we're going through, the different eras getting to that point. You wouldn't have been old enough to really have had this experience at this time, Sarah, would you?
No. So my first convention that I actually attended was Supernova in, I feel like it was 2011. And it was, so much from the country. So I remember wanting to go to anime conventions when I was a teenager, but they were a little bit expensive and it was a long way to travel, and my parents didn't really know what they were and they didn't want to come with me. So not unfortunately something I got to do. But yeah, I went because there was Tom Felton, who was Draco Malfoy in the Harry Potter movies, was a guest, and I was very, very happy to meet him as a little Harry Potter nerd that I was.
Well, I think I think I remember you telling me that, and down the track, I think I have got a promo for that very convention because I think you mentioned that. I don't know if I used it or not, but I think I did. So that's interesting. Do you remember, Dags, maybe the first pro-con you went to, and did you notice a big difference? And did you go sort of, wow, this is something different?
Yeah, it's funny. My recollections are interesting. So the first pro-con, which is a professionally run convention, not an expo, it's more of a convention size that we're sort of familiar with, but it's run for money, was Starfest in 1993. Now, Starfest was an American group who came out here and they ran 3 conventions in a row, 93, 94, 95, at the Southern Cross Hotel when it was still there. And the first person they brought out was Walter Koenig from Star Trek. And of course, it was the first time an actor from Star Trek had actually been in Melbourne. They'd been in other parts of the country, but hadn't been here before. And there were 3,000 people turned up to it. And that, to us, who'd been around for a while, was just like, oh my God, that number's insane, right? But they ran it in the pro-con fashion, where all the focus was primarily on the guests, because Dave McConnell, I think, was there, the editor of Starlog, and they had all their presentations and whatever else. And that, look, I had a great time because it was new, it was different, it was something special. Fast forward 6 years later, I went to a convention in Sydney called Best of Both Worlds. The Best of Both Worlds was a husband and wife team who were putting together all these events, bringing out all these actors, and they brought out a lot, actually, using the pro-con format. And, of course, I went up there in 1998, and I walked in there thinking, well, this is run by the fans. It's not like Americans coming over. And I thought, well, I've turned up and I go, okay, well, where's all the programming and where's the video rooms and where's the arch? They had none of that at all. It was all the pro-con stuff. And the pro-con format takes that stuff out because they keep it to the basic minimum, which is the guests. And I was shattered. I really was shattered. And that then gave an indication as what the future was going to be like, because that was where the focus was all on the actor or actors, the autographs, the photographs, and very little substance. And so even though Starfest followed the same format, just the sheer scale and novelty was really good, as opposed to Best of Both Worlds, which followed the same thing. But it was kind of shattering that things were changing, and it changed very quickly after that.
That is one of the things Dags and I have both talked about in the past, where the new cons might have more guests lined up. But the first one, I kind of remember going, hey, there's something missing here. It was actually a big Doctor Who one. It was the Lords of Time, run locally, where they have that very same setup, where you have the presentations by the actors, and then the rest of the time is in queues getting autographs and photographs, and then waiting and doing it over and over again. And I kind of thought, well, this is amazing. All these people are here, but the experience just doesn't have the same sort of heart and soul as the smaller conventions, where there'd be different rooms and people would break up into their groups of interest and have really good, long, heart-to-heart chats about stuff. And I even remember being in the dealer's room, sort of having more of a good time talking to collectors than I had at this huge convention with lots of actors and autographs and photos.
Now, Sarah, I know you've got a picture that you wanted to bring up, which I put together for another show about the breakdown. Oh, you got the evolution. So, okay. So, yeah.
So we've got the evolution of conventions in Melbourne. So we're going from back in the 80s through 85 through 95. We had PC Expo 0, Worldcons 1, ProCons 3, FanCons 15, 7 clubs and 8 independent. And then going on to 2010s to 2020, we had 28 approximately PC cons. We have 1 Worldcon and 20 plus pro cons, which are 3 and only 3 fan cons, and those are all independent. They're not run by clubs. And then 2000 to 2020, I feel like some of these numbers might be slightly off. 2000 to 2020 PC conventions, it's 31 plus or minus, 1 Worldcon and 35 plus pro cons, and 6 fan cons in that time, 2 clubs and 4 independent.
It's amazing how it changes, eh?
Yeah.
So that's just in Melbourne, though, isn't it?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. So
Sarah, you think the numbers are slightly off? Where do you think they're off?
Oh, sorry, I got a little confused by the 2010 to 2020 and then the 2000 to 2020.
Yeah, in the
That's where I got
original,
confused.
in the original presentation, the 2000 to 2020 had been covered over. So it was just saying 10 years, 85 to 95, then 2010 to 2020. So it's 10 years for each one. Then it was like, just as a comparison between 2000 and 2020, so 20 years, right?
Yes.
There were 31.
I see what you mean. Got it.
Yeah, pop culture expos, 31 plus, 35 plus pro cons, but fan cons or independent conventions, which we used to have back in the day, there was only 6 in 20 years, which is not a very good ratio. So
yeah. No, I haven't seen that many fan conventions these days. I know that in the time I've been in the scene, at least, those fan conventions and those independent ones, there's been a lot less of them. They still are there, but you sort of need to know about them more, or be in that fandom in order to, have them on your radar.
Would it be true to say, Dags, that the last fan cons run were the Con 80, Con 70 and 60 ones you ran?
Yeah, from a media side, yes. So I ran the last 3, not just myself, but all these other people as well. The last 3 independent media conventions, and I say independent because they're not affiliated to fan clubs. Back in the day, fan clubs used to run conventions, so they used to support each other. But the 3 that we did, Con 9 from Outer Space, Con 70, Con 80, and Con 9 from Outer Space is now 10 years. So it was 10 years ago since we did the first one. But those last 3, which were the last 3, they were all independent. They're all media based, and that was it. So if those 3 events had not occurred, then the previous one would have been in 2007. And that was with Jedi Force Expo that Star Walking did from the media side, not the literature side. They've still continued on. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So yeah, the media side does skew things a little bit. All right.
Here's a question for you, Sarah.
Do you think cons today would still be able to get away with designated rooms showing videos, etc., with all the copyright issues today? They do. I know some conventions do have screening rooms. It might not be the same as, I think probably a lot of them are more sponsored these days, but I know, the supernatural conventions that Hub run, they'll often have a room that is playing an episode of Supernatural or something like that. And then, I've also, I've gone in and sat and relaxed to rest my feet at things like Supernova and Comic-Con in those screening rooms. So they definitely still do.
So the way you get around it, Michael, is that if you were just charging to show videos and nothing else, you couldn't do it. But because it's part of the programming and you're saying to people, well, we're charging them to get into the event, but the videos are for free, that's how you get around it. By the same token, you're not having like 100,000 people turn up. You're only having maybe 100, 200 plus, and it goes by the wayside. Some people are concerned about it, but by the same token, you go, you know what? These aren't things that haven't been screened anywhere. These are videos we've had for 10, 20, 30 years. It's nothing new, so it's all kind of groovy. And just to answer a question, Daniel asked whether Con 9, Con 70, and Con 80 were included in the numbers. Yes, they were. They were listed in the independent section. So there you go.
No, it's Oops, sorry. They are expensive to run. Yes. I know that we always, when I was more active with the Melbourne Muggles, when the Melbourne Muggles was a more active group, we always talked about doing a Muggle con. And unfortunately, the financial aspect was the thing that prevented us from ever being able to get that off the ground. Remember UK cons where we watched stuff on 16mm film? That sounds amazing. I also know that I've been told stories of the early anime cons where they would have a live translator. They'd get the VHSs from Japan, and then they'd have someone in the room reading, just translating them live in Japanese. So they'd pretty much they'd either have a script that they'd printed out that somebody had got for them, or they would just on the spot translate. So because it was before the days of subtitles and dubs.
Yeah, Chad was telling me today when I was talking about this subject that at the early manifests, people would rock up with stuff hot off the internet on their hard drive, and fans going to the conventions would take them to the video programming room and go, we've got this. And they'd show something no one else had seen because it had just been downloaded in the very early days of torrents and downloads and things like that.
Just hidden in the depths. What was that, Dave?
Yeah, guys comment about the video room is kind of the screenings. So it was common for independent conventions or fan-run conventions to have a film screening of some sort. If they could get a premiere of a brand new movie, that was considered a big coup. And that was just part of the programming. So when it came to video programs, though, when you sit and think about it, it's like, who would go to an event just to watch movies with all this other stuff going on outside? But the video rooms were very, very popular. And in my day, and I can attest to this because I ran one, they used to go for 24 hours. So you'd actually have them running for 24 hours for 3 days. the video room would be open all night long, and it was a bit of a thing. So it was classed as an alternative to the programming. You're thinking, oh, well, I don't want to see this talk. I don't want to see that talk. I'm not interested in this. I'll just go and sit in the video room and watch a video. And you would think, who would do that? But people did all the time. And in fact, on one occasion, it was actually Star Walking, the first convention in 1989. I got a shock because Jerry Bullock, Boba Fett, was the guest, and he was actually in the video room watching a video. I thought, what are the chances of that? So, yeah, they were for everybody. At some point, people found their way into the video room, so it was a bit of a thing. So, yeah.
There was a convention in St Kilda, I think it was Nemesis, was it, or something, where they had Star Trek Next Generation showing all night, and they were new episodes that hadn't been shown here in the video screening room, and for the entire night, there was about 40 or 50 people that sat up the entire night watching them, which meant I had to stay in the dealer's room and watch my stuff all night because it wasn't locked off.
Sorry, I've got a cat. Eowyn has decided that she would like to be involved with this particular discussion, and I'm just going to keep her away from cables.
Her favourite convention would have been Kitten Con with Tim Brooke Taylor.
Very good.
Yes, of course, that one. Actually, I feel like Eowyn's probably a secret anime fan. So moving on to the next slide, we've got the anime cons in Melbourne. So we've got Manifest. Of course, Manifest ran for many years and was a very popular anime convention. So that one went from 1999 through to 2013. It finished, unfortunately, after, I remember the year it finished, there was a fire in the convention, which unfortunately was a bit of a death knell for that one. And then since then we have Anime Festival, which is run by Madman, that's come up to fill that void. And there's been a few other things that have been looked at along the time as well. Did either of you ever go to any anime conventions?
No, I do remember a couple of times being in Melbourne and going, there must be a convention on somewhere that I don't know anything about because there's all these people in cosplay. And because I have never been in any anime circles, I didn't know it was on and didn't know it was there. But it was a big enough event that over the years, a couple of times, just on public transport, you'd see a lot of people in anime costumes. And it is one of those interesting things because if you went back to our generation and tried to run an anime con, you might get a couple of guys turn up for Speed Racer and Marine Boy and things like that. But it would not work because there were just not enough people into it. So that's probably anime and video game conventions are the one things that I have definitely seen a swing towards as I've got older and away from the more traditional ones that I grew up with. So probably you would have been more involved with the anime and the gaming stuff, Sarah. Have you had many experiences with them?
Yeah, so look, I've been to the anime cons, the gaming cons. So Michael said that a friend of mine was one of the producers of Manifest. They have an anniversary party every year on the date of the fire. Oh dear. No, I do know. I know someone who she was involved in the early anime conventions in Australia, and they were very much just a screening. They were a screening with that. They were a VHS hot from Japan, so it wasn't. It was before they even had. That it was even coming from the internet. They were just getting a VHS sent to them from Japan. It was something that had freshly aired, and then somebody would work out a script and they would do a live reading for those subtitles. So that's what a lot of those early anime conventions were, and I think they were a very small thing. Unfortunately, I didn't have get a lot of research together for those because it's a little bit difficult to find some of that stuff. A lot of it's not online, but they definitely were there, just in the fringes.
I actually think going to a screening that had a live reading would have been a really amazing experience. Like sometimes with sci-fi movies, there's a shadow theatre, Rocky Horror and Blues Brothers do that too, but I have seen it with other movies, and it would be a really unique experience at that point in time that I don't think you'd really see again.
Yeah. Look, it's one of those things that unfortunately it died around the time that subtitles became more popular because people want to listen to the original Japanese voice cast. Christy has said the anime cons had a bad rap among parents because of the sometimes minimalistic female cosplay. Well, honestly, I think that's even comic conventions, you get that. Even, hell, a Star Wars convention, you get a Slave Leia. That's just one of those things where it's a time and a place situation, and as long as the person's cosplay is bathing suit levels, appropriateness, they're normally fine. So as long as it covers them as much as a skimpy bikini, there shouldn't really be a problem. But it's only when the person is doing lewd behaviors to accompany that costume that things become a little bit difficult.
And I'd like to point out, I never go to conventions dressed in anything less than a skimpy bikini, so I'm fine.
I know, Aaron, you're very well behaved.
It's one of the reasons why I stay away from them. So, yeah.
So now we're moving on to the big Melbourne conventions. You know them, you love them. We've got Supernova, Armageddon, AMC. These are the ones that were around for quite some time. These were well, not AMC because Armageddon became AMC. So Supernova and Armageddon, those were the big two outside of the anime sphere for quite a while when I first joined the scene. So in the early 2010s. Were you involved in both of these ones, Aaron and Dags?
I think we both were kind of involved from different points of view. I know Dags, a couple of them would have been there with skywalking or having tables promoting his own convention, and I was at a lot of them as a dealer. And I tell you what, the difference between being a dealer at the Star Wars fan club or the Star Trek fan club or at one of these pro cons is about $6,000 to $7,000.
Wow.
For a lot of tables, where I have done many local club conventions that have been for charity or they've just been fan run, and it's usually about $60 a table, and you go from that, and it's not even like gradual going up to different conventions. It's like you want a booth, it's $5,000. You want an extra table and some you actually, people don't realize you get a booth for that, but you don't get the tables, you don't get the electricity, you don't get any of everything like that. That's a trick that fan clubs have been missing for years and years, because you pay your $60 and they set you up with everything and you're right to go. So it is very interesting again seeing when a pro con is run how much money they try to get on every level of things. And one of the things that the most expensive thing with running a business is employing staff. And conventions are set up in an amazing way where they get hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. And I think that's something that's kind of been changing a bit, where they have to pay them more recently. But I think a lot of these conventions couldn't have run if it wasn't for so many enthusiastic people who are willing to give their time. And in some ways, it kind of killed some of the fan conventions, because all of a sudden you could go to the fan convention and help run that, but you could go to the pro con and help run that, and suddenly you have greater access to autographs, photographs, being a minder of someone that you might admire, and things like that, where there isn't so much of that opportunity with the smaller conventions.
So I personally never volunteered for those ones. The only one I volunteered for was PAX, which we will get to in a minute, which had a much better benefits in my personal opinion. But yeah, you did see all of the uni students that were interested in fandom starting off in those volunteer roles, and a lot of them would have now got careers in event spaces because they just loved it, and it allowed them to discover that passion that they might otherwise not have discovered, which is very cool.
It is interesting to see how much power a t-shirt with a convention on saying helper will give someone as well. Sorry, Dags.
Oh, no,
Dags has been waiting very patiently. What would you like to say, Dags?
So there were a couple of test pop culture expos in the early 2000s, but when Armageddon came here in 2007, that was the arrival of pop culture expos on a regular basis here. And Armageddon was the only one here for a period of time. In Sydney, there was Supernova. And of course, at that point, Oz Comic Con didn't exist yet. So we would hear about Supernova in Sydney, and we had Armageddon down here. And of course, Armageddon is based on the New Zealand group, on the group. So a few years later, then Supernova started arriving here, and so we had the two events. And then in 2011, it was announced that Oz Comic Con was coming. So suddenly, by 2012, we had all three of them. So they're all sort of spreading their wings, going here, there, and everywhere. And that's sort of, I remember when Armageddon occurred in 2007, it was fantastic. Every man and his dog went, right? Now, not everybody went back for the following events, because some people said, well, it's big and it's wonderful, it's great, but it's not their cup of tea. But it was the one event where everyone went to. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic. But, of course, what we didn't know at the time is that as these events went on year after year after year, they all had the same look and feel between each one, and you couldn't tell them apart. And especially with later on with Armageddon / AMC and Supernova being held in the same venue, they actually looked identical. You couldn't tell one from the other. So for a period of time, I think the novelty factor was really good, and a lot of people really dialed into it and got a lot out of it. But I agree with Aaron, depending what you were trying to achieve. Now, if you're a person just going along to look at things, it was great. If you wanted to meet all these guests, it was great. But if you're a dealer, there was definitely a catch there, and it was the finances involved. And I know a lot of people who spend a lot of money on booths having to try and make massive amounts of money just to recoup the costs regarding that. And they did milk you for everything. If you wanted a power lead, just to power something on your table, it was an extra $100. I was like, what? And that's ridiculous. I know that because we actually tried to organise something like that for one of our tables. So, yeah, there is definitely the dollar first mindset, depending on your perspective about how these things are run. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I do know that a lot of those earlier sorry, I've completely lost my train of thought. Aaron, what were you saying?
The other thing that I don't think either dads might, but you might not realise being a dealer, when the next cons are coming up and they've got you as someone who went previously, it is like telemarketing where you get calls all the time. We're going to offer you a special deal for this booth. And you're like, no, too expensive. And they will call again a couple of weeks later and a couple of weeks later. It really is sell. We can upgrade to this. If you take a booth, we can upgrade to this. We can upgrade to this. We've got a special deal. We can give you a bigger area and it'll cost you this, but it would normally cost you this. And it's all about the money.
Yeah, there is definitely a school of thought to say, who are you as at the event? Are you a professional business and you want the big ass booth at $3, $4, $5 grand a pop? Are you the artist alley kind of person who's just trying to look after themselves? Are you a fan club? And there's been a school of thought in recent years where the independents, the low end food chain, if you will, the fan clubs and all the artist alleys guys are getting kind of pushed out in favour of bringing in the more professional groups, because obviously the space that they take up, they can charge more for. So, it's been very, very hit and miss over the years. And I guess depending if you're a regular person who has a table, you could probably say, well, this year I got jibbed really badly by where I was located and what I was charged for versus this other location or this other event where I was placed in a really good spot. So it can be a bit of a risk sometimes, depending on who you are and where you are.
Yeah. So I did want to now move on to the beginning of the Australian Megacon, and that is, of course, PAX Australia. And as any good little gamer I was there at that first PAX Australia, held at the showgrounds on a very cold, I think it was June or July. It was middle of winter. It was raining. Everything was a wind tunnel. It was muddy, it was messy, and it was fantastic. It was very much the first convention in Australia which felt global. And that is because it was being run by Penny Arcade Expo and having that Reed Pop money behind it. They were able to get all the sponsors, and they were able to get these huge displays, huge lights. It became this thing where a regular convention, all the other conventions, would just be quite low to the ground, everything was, maybe a foot or two higher than, a person. Whereas these megacons came in and it's all the way up to the roof with lights, and they're just, it's just brilliant. And it's so different to what we had until then. Did both of you attend those ones?
I've attended PAX. To be totally honest, it isn't my thing at all, but my son loves gaming, so I've been to about 3 or 4 of them. I end up going to the retro gaming area and wanting to play pinball and all the old game machines. He likes seeing all the new stuff. The one thing that is interesting with PAX, a lot of the time with Comic Cons, we seem to get ripped off in that all the big announcements are overseas. They're never going to announce the Marvel lineup at Melbourne Comic Con or anything like that. At PAX, I did notice they would have events that were launching systems and different games that were exclusive to the event in Melbourne, which really surprises me, because even as a toy dealer, when you go to the toy fairs, everything's been announced before, the Melbourne Retail Toy Fair is on. So that is interesting, and I do agree what you're saying about using the facility so the actual space is utilised, not just the ground, but there's displays that go to the roof. And it's almost like when a big pop concert comes into town and someone like U2 brings their entire rig in. So you've got the convention centre, and out the back you've got these massive semi-trailers that are unloading rigs that are custom designed for these conventions. So it is definitely something I've never seen at a convention before.
For myself, I've been once, and I was able to get tickets to go in. Like Garen, it's not really my cup of tea either, but I was very curious about it. And of course, what they were able to trade on the name because they said it's the first time it's occurring outside of the US, which in itself is a bit of a big deal. Limited tickets, which is very, very clever. So if you miss out, you miss out, and that's it. Too bad, so sad. And I think because it caters for gaming on all sorts of levels, both the recent computer stuff, board games, role playing, and whatever else. I think it's an ingenious concept and has worked really, really well. And I can't imagine the logistics behind it. Thinking how many electrical power leads do you need to run everything? It's just been mind blowing looking at it from that perspective. But it's done very well for itself and has a huge demand. And it's so I went along and I looked at it. I thought I get it, and it was all good. It was great. It was wonderful. And but I've been there, done that, and I'm okay now. But I can see if you're a gaming person, it would probably have more of appeal to you, especially as being a one-off annual event, and it hasn't occurred now for a couple of years. But when it does come back, it will have such a big pull, more so than a pop culture expo, because it's just one. That's it. And sometimes the limited numbers can do wonders. So if you look at currently with your pop culture expos, you've got Oz Comic Con and you've got Supernova in Melbourne. If one of those drops off and there's one left standing, right, they get the monopoly on everything. And then suddenly their numbers will increase. They will get bigger because it's the only place to go to. And especially whether you're a dealer or you want to meet the cast and crew or whatever else, or you're a costume person, you're thinking, I've got one place to show my costume to 20, 30,000 people. Whoever's the last man standing, they're going to do very well over it. And so PAX, as PAX has shown, just being the only kid in town doing what you're doing can give you massive benefits.
Yes. So PAX is another one that's interesting because it is there were so few in the world, especially when it first came out. So yes, limited to one in 20,000, something like that. Yeah. So I don't know exactly how many passes they have. They're currently advertising. They're nearly sold out of. I think they're sold out of 3-day passes for this year's one that's in October, and they've got one or two left. So as Sully has said, ours was the second one after Prime in Seattle.
The advantage of having the limited numbers is you can actually print your own ticket price. So now that the thing has been well established and everybody knows about it. Now, I don't know how much it costs to go. So let's assume it's $100 per day, right? I've just embed that, right? And for all these years, it's been $100 a day. Now that it's established and is the place to go to for a gamer, they can then say, well, we're going to make it $150 now, right? Or $180 or $200. Now, of course, some people will say, well, I can't afford that. I can't go. And there'll be like tears everywhere. But somebody else who said, well, I couldn't go because I couldn't get a ticket in the first place because it kept selling out. I've got $200. I'll pay for it. And as a result, the profit margin will go up. The numbers will still stay the same. And the people who missed out, well, they just miss out. And but you still get what you need. So I don't know if that'll ever happen or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. So, but yeah, that's a very, very clever marketing strategy.
Something that's actually happened to me about PAX. So I went to the first one, I paid and I attended, and I went all 3 days with some friends that I studied games with at university. And the second year, I couldn't afford it. I couldn't budget for it. It was just so expensive. Also, they'd moved. It was now in the convention center, so I think the price went up a little bit from the first year to the second year. So because it. Sorry, not the convention. Yeah, the convention center. Jeff Sheck. So given that had happened, I found another way in, which was enforcing. And this was the very smart thing that PAX offered that the other conventions weren't doing at that time, was you would work one of 3 shifts in a day. So there was morning, there was afternoon, and there was evening, because PAX runs until late at night. So you get to choose one of those shifts. You work I think it was like a 5-6 hour shift, and then you get a free ticket for the rest of the day. And it's just one of those very brilliant things, and a very brilliant way to get a lot of people very excited about your event and working at your event for free, because you're giving them something in return. And in that case, it was access to this premiere show. So that was something that very, very clever. And I was an enforcer for about, I think, 5 years until I started getting paid work instead. So I've been labeled a deserter by many people in that community.
So from the pop culture expo point of view, one of the things that they did, which was absolutely ingenious, is they kept the day price cheap. All right. Now, traditionally, conventions used to be relatively expensive to attend because they had to cover all their costs. So if you work on the mindset, you say, how about we make the price cheap, $20 a day, all right? to attend this enormous event. Right now, he's saying $20 a day. I'm talking about like 20 years ago, or when they first started. They're $30-something now, and with the idea being that people say, well, it's a cheap day out. So even if you go along, you look around and go, you know what, it doesn't really cut my mustard. Yeah, whatever. I've only spent $30 to get in. If you charge them $100 to get in, they're going to be complaining potentially. So the way to get extra numbers in to cover your costs is make the prices cheap. And it was very, very clever because it was completely different to the formula that other events had used up to that point, and they still use it today. And anybody who thought, okay, well, I'll just go along for a day, it's only $30, no big deal. And I think that's one of the best marketing ideas that they've had. So we looked at it from what PAX could do if they wanted to, up the price and just lose some people but gain people from somewhere else, versus a pop culture expo, which keeps the price low to start with and appeals to everybody. So it's not just your fans or your people in the community, it's your general public as well, which is what they cater for. So it's very, very, very clever.
It's very interesting, especially seeing those differences, because one thing that PAX doesn't have that a lot of those other conventions do have is there are no guests. There are panels, there are competitions, there are tournaments, but there are no guests. And that is something that I think that's one of the reasons the price is a little bit higher for entry, because no one's going to be buying autographs, no one's buying photographs, there's not getting any money in that way. So I think that's part of it as well.
But as I mentioned, I agree with you. But as I mentioned, it's the exclusivity and the fact that it is such a unique thing. If they just said, we're going to run 2 of them a year, right, in Melbourne, so one at the start of the year, one at the end of the year, whatever, 6 months between them, right, you would suddenly find the interest would drop off. It could take a little while, but somebody would say, well, instead of going to both, I'll just go to one, because ultimately not a lot changes between them, right? So you've got to keep the people wanting more. It's the old dangling carrots scenario, and that's why it's so successful. So, but even they could ruin their own market if they wanted to, as we saw with the pop culture expos when we had 3 of them turning up in a year for the 8 or 9 years, and people said, well, I'm not going to go to all 3, I'll just go to 2 or go to 1. So you can dilute your marketplace if you're not careful, but obviously the PAX people are very switched on, and it's the reason why something like Celebration is very successful. Once every couple of years, okay, and people travel from all over the world, because it doesn't happen all the time, which is very, very clever.
It's one of those things that's interesting when you do it by location as well, because they did do that and they kept the prices reasonable for the very first Oz Comic Con, and that was an absolute shambles and debacle, because they oversold. People who had tickets couldn't get in because they had house limit numbers. People who bought stuff, came out to take back to the car and went to get in again, couldn't get in again for the day because it was full. And it was one of those things, a lot of people said, this is going to kill Comic-Con on the very first Comic-Con. But like you said, Dags, it didn't. It just made the people who couldn't get in want to go more the next day and to the next one and make sure that they got in. I do wonder what it would have happened if they'd run that at the showgrounds where there's no size limits, if that could have been like one of the biggest conventions ever hosted in Australia. Because at the time, we had the dollar that was parity to America, so they could bring over big stars, which they just can't do anymore because it had cost too much. But that had Stan Lee, Patrick Stewart. I don't know if you got into that one. That was just
I had
that was the one
amazing at the same time.
Yeah, I had a dealer's table there for Con 70 or whatever it was. So I was hearing everything that was going on. I heard out later on what had happened is the event had stopped selling tickets when they ran out, but the venue kept selling them. That's the reason why they overkilled it all. So everybody pointed the finger at Oz Comic Con saying they screwed the pooch, and it wasn't them at all. Actually, it was
no, it wasn't. It was the convention center had no idea what they'd got themselves into.
But I mean, they come back in the following year in 2013, mate, all is forgiven.
Actually, the next year they weren't allowed back. Comic-Con, that Comic-Con got conventions, pop culture conventions, temporarily banned from the convention center, and they were at the exhibition and convention building, the one that historic one.
The exhibition buildings, yeah. But I mean, from the point of view of the attendees, right, those who weren't in the know, shows back, guests are in, and of course, you can. The argument would be that regardless of who's running what, if they dangle a carrot of saying, oh, your favorite actor is turning up, well, you're going no matter what. So regardless of who's running it or whether you had a good time last year, this year, whatever. So all is forgiven very, very quickly when it comes to getting your autograph and your photograph. And here we are today. Look, and
they had
one of the last 2 standing. So there you go. Yeah,
they had Stan Lee, Patrick Stewart, and William Shatner, and that was their first ever one. Of course, it was going to be crazy, and anyone who thought that it was going to be a quiet day.
Shatner was the following year. Okay.
Was the following year? Okay, my apologies.
That was at the
but it was
exhibition
definitely
booth.
it was, and I think Jason Momoa as well that first year.
Yeah.
I think he wasn't as big as he is now,
No,
but he was still.
It was Stargate time still. I think he'd just done Game of Thrones the first season, and that wasn't out yet. Even I don't know.
We're getting actually to the end of the show, and we haven't touched on an area that I did want to look at. Do you think it can get?
I'm going to cut you off. Because I'm in charge of this, we can go an extra 10 minutes. There you go.
Oh.
Go to 10 past.
Thank you, Dax. Thank you.
Do you think we can go bigger, or have we hit the critical mass? I mean, Jeff Shed is at its limit. You could do stuff at the showgrounds. What do you see in the future? Are we going to get even bigger cons, or is it hit that level where we're about right?
I think in order to have bigger cons, they need to build bigger convention centers. So they would need to have an expansion of basically Jeff Shed would have to make an expansion, a huge expansion, which would likely eat into the hotels in the area. And there's not really room for them to expand unless they went up, I guess. That would be necessary in order to make conventions in Australia any bigger, because you've also got to keep in mind that some of those convention centers that they have in the US, they like where they have San Diego Comic-Con, it's about 5 times the size of Jeff Shed. It's a huge, absolutely huge venue. And so as a result of that, any Australian con, and when I've spoken to at PAX, the Americans that come over to experience PAX Oz, they have always said it's a really small show, and then us locals are like, what? It's huge, but compared to those international conventions, it's very small. It's a tiny little drop in the ocean. So that's our only limit at the moment is space.
I'm of the opinion that say you use Jeff Shed, but you use all of it. And you then say, from capacity points of view, sure, you're limited by how many physical people you can put in there. Okay, there's a limit. So let's say it's 40,000. That's your cutoff point. Having a cutoff point is actually a good thing, because it means that people will want to go. And if you're the 40,001, and you've missed out, what you're going to be upset about, especially some really good stuff going on. From all you would need to focus on is saying, okay, what happens within those walls? So if it turns out that you can accommodate 200 dealers, okay, and you've got 201 dealers who want to go, someone misses out. So there becomes the demand. And I don't think you need to make the thing physically larger. You've just got to make the quality just as good, if not better, and make it a bit more exclusive. And if it turns out people are turned away and they go, well, I can't get a ticket to get in, they're going to be busting their chops the following year to get back in. So physical size isn't as important. And I don't think you can ever reach, our population doesn't support it anyway.
No.
So if somebody said, oh, we've got an Oz Comic Con, we were planning for 80,000 people to turn up, and they don't get 80,000 because there just physically isn't that enough people to go, it wouldn't necessarily work. So I think the capacity of what we've got now kind of works as it is. It's all about the quality of the event that makes people want to go.
This is another question mainly for Dags, I guess. What do you think is the future for fan cons?
It's funny. So from the literature side, they've continued on, and they will continue on, and we haven't really touched on. It's not really what we're talking about today. For fan-run conventions, which are financed by independent people and or fan clubs, there was meant to be one last year / this year with a COVID thing, which was Force 5, and I think you got a picture of it there. And of course, that hasn't gone ahead. I think fan-run media conventions are gone. I can't imagine anybody stepping up saying, yep, I want to put one on. It's a $25,000 investment, and that's without the guests. I can't imagine that actually occurring. And I don't know if there's a demand for it. I mean, there's an eclectic demand. There are some people out there who say, oh, yeah, I'd love to go to something like that. But there's not enough people to warrant putting one on. So I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but I don't know if I will be. So, yeah. Sorry, put that picture back up too. There you go.
Yeah, so I put that one together.
One of those very sad things. Sorry, Aaron.
No, sorry. No, I just put that one together because I just wanted to highlight that there are still fan clubs that do run events. We don't really have the huge 3-day conventions with guests anymore. The Orlando Convention Center is 5 times the size of Jeff Shed, and it had 2 buildings. Star Wars Celebration, which has been held there, still feels small because of the side of the bigger venue isn't necessarily better. So I agree, the bigger venue isn't necessarily better, and that's what I was highlighting with some of the fan club ones, where you might only have 30 or 40 people turn up, but the atmosphere can be a lot better for those people than the huge, big multimedia pro-run event, which is, pushing as many people through as they can get the money for. The other slide I've got there, which is just show, if we go to the next one, I think it's the last one I put together. This is what choice we have in Australia at the moment. If you look at this is in the next 2 weeks. You've got AusCon 2022 in Brisbane. I don't know if the dates have changed on that, but there's Crunchyroll Expo, which is the anime one that's, I think, basically started as Manifest and went to MadCon and then has evolved into this. That's on the 17th and 18th as well. There's BendyCon, which is a local one. It's more of a show like a record fair or a comic book fair than an actual convention, but they are going that way. And it's interesting to see a satellite city like Bendigo is able to have these once or twice a year, and they've been quite successful. And then we've got PAX coming up in a couple of weeks as well. So the fan community has a lot to choose from because of the pro cons that are put on by people. And I think for us growing up, we might say we had a better experience, but we definitely didn't have the opportunities to go to as many events, meet as many people from behind the scenes, and definitely not actors that people have today. So for me, it's a bit of a double-edged sword, but I am really glad that these events happen.
No, definitely. Look, I've also when I was in America in 2019, I was very lucky to go to NerdCon in Pasadena, which was a very small little LA con, and it was fascinating because it's this tiny little event. It sort of felt like a toy fair in many ways. Just it was that small, but it had all of these incredible actors and guests that you would never get in Australia. We were chatting with Alan Oppenheimer from everything, the voice actor from everything ever, and he was saying, oh yeah, I'd love to come to Australia, just somebody contact my agent, I'll come out. And he's in his 90s, so, and he was very happy to suggest the suggestion he'd come out. But yeah, look, it's one of those things that I think that is one of the things that stops us, because a con has to be in some ways bigger in order to justify the cost of the guests, or you end up with something in Australia like hub events, which they're fantastic. You get to really have a one-on-one good experience with those guests, but they are expensive, and they have to be, because in order to have that experience in Australia, you need to pay a premium because it's so expensive to get those guests out here.
That is something that has never changed. And a lot of people, this goes back to what Dags was saying earlier, don't realize the original conventions would cost you a couple of $100s to attend. And this was in the 80s when that was a lot of money, but you would not have to pay for autographs. In fact, I would go down and whack down everything, every picture I had of David Prowse and say, there you go, sign the lot for me, kind of thing. The horrible capitalist dog I am, and then reselling them later. But it is one of those things that is really good about the conventions, that also, like Dag said, you can as a family go for you and your family for under $100, and you don't have to spend anything in there, and you can see all the guests, signing, and you go, oh, I saw the twins from Harry Potter. I didn't meet them, but I saw them, and that's pretty amazing for someone who's a Harry Potter fan. So as I was saying, it does give the opportunity to see and meet people that couldn't happen any other way. Is interesting going to conventions in different countries because they are run differently and they all have a unique feel. Were you going to
in between the fan run stuff and the big expos are the pro cons, which are your hub productions and first contact conventions and all the rest of it. And they're obviously designed to run and make money, but they have their attendances are relatively small, 200 maximum, I think, is how they work. But all their entire structure is based around whoever turns up, the guest, right? The guest is the critical factor. No guest is just no show. It's as simple as that. So if anything, they're more under threat from the expos than anybody else. So if an expo says they're bringing out 30 people, and as a pro-con, you're saying, well, one of those 30 was going to be my guest, you're screwed, because people will go to the because it's sorry, the expo, because it's cheaper, right? Much cheaper, and it's the same person. So if anyone's under threat, it would be the ProCon people. And I know for a fact they've had events that have had to be cancelled because they couldn't sell tickets because they were bringing out Fred and Charlie, and no one gives a rat's ass about Fred and Charlie. So, and of course, over the past 10 years, or 15 years, so many actors coming out to Australia, people are now very, very picky and choosy as to who they want to see. And of course, a ProCon by default isn't a cheap event. So as opposed to $30 for an expo, you're looking at $120, whatever it is. That's the basic ticket for a ProCon, and a lot of people are going to be very selective about that. So if any convention format was going to be under threat for the future, whether they'll be around 10 years from now, I reckon those guys, Hub and or First Contact in Melbourne at least, would probably be sort of quaking in their boots a little bit as a guest. They'll still have successes, but whether they have continual successes and sustainability, that's the thing I'd be wondering.
Yeah. It comes down to, I was at the last All Hell Breaks Loose in Melbourne. I was working there, and it really does come down to those fans they are so enthusiastic. Michael said, please make the autographs out to eBay, which I believe might be a Simpsons reference. I feel like I see you there, Mike. So yeah, look, it's one of those things where as long as people are willing to pay, as long as people continue being fans of things, they will continue to go to whatever type of convention suits them. And I don't think we're ever going to see a death of all conventions. I don't think we're ever going to get to a point where it's only the Megacon and nothing else. None of the little cons still get a place. But thankfully, I think there's a bit of room for everyone. So that's my thoughts at least.
Yeah, I basically agree. I basically think conventions will be around in some shape or form forever. And that is just because fans being fans, if there wasn't a Pro One put on, fans would say, well, we want something to happen, and they'd eventually get around to doing it themselves.
That's Absolutely. A very good point. That could happen. People just get so frustrated by what's currently out there. They go, why can't we just do this? And the whole cycle starts right back to where it began. With only a handful of people saying, let's just put on a show, keep it simple, do this, do that, and then it gets legs and away she goes. It would be very interesting to see if that happen. And I know there'd be a lot of people, even that I know, who would come out of the woodwork to go, you know what, I'll go along and support that, because not everybody is enamored with the pro-con thing. One of the things that bugs them is the thing for profit, the money thing, right? Traditional conventions used to make money and give it to charity, whereas pro-cons do it to line the pockets of the organisers, which is fair enough. It's a business. The expos are identical. So it would be interesting to see whether it all reset itself and then started from the beginning. So, and of course, if that doesn't float your boat, you just go to a literature convention. They're still plodding along as per normal. So, but yeah, I will be very intrigued to see if that actually occurs. The only problem would be, and I've discussed this before with other people, if you said, like say it's 2025, right? And somebody says, you know what, I'm sick of the pro-cons, sick of the expos, I want to run a convention. The downside is the people who have the experience and knowing how to do that, there's not many of them left. To say, I want to run a convention, what do I do? And people will be all looking at each other going, we've got no idea, because all that experience is gone. And that would be the hard part, because it's not because once you're dealing with money, dealing with venue costs and accommodation and people's memberships, you've still got to put a show on. And if you're not really au fait as to what you're doing, it can fall apart very quickly. And there have been fan-run cons that have run at a loss. And when that happens, someone has to foot the bill. And that's what's the concern. But if it does happen, as in the show goes on, yeah, awesome.
Yeah. All right. I think we've pretty much touched on everything tonight. Dags, Aaron, did either of you have anything else to add?
No, I think we've really covered all the topics that we wanted to have a look at.
Fantastic.
Yeah, pretty cool. Yeah. I talk about this stuff a lot. So, I got it's a broken record scenario from my perspective. But I will let you talk about this.
Well, thank you everyone for joining us another week of FanView. If you want to watch our previous episodes, check out our YouTube channel. You can view all of the old episodes there. But until next week, we have been FanView. Have a good night, guys.
Good night, guys.
Bye.